Good morning again. I'm back. For those of you who understand everything there is to know about comparative analyses and you heard it this morning, feel free to snooze as long as you don't snore too much or drool on your neighbor. For those of you who still have maybe some outstanding questions, I'm going to go over a lot of the things that you heard Ms. Burke talk about this morning from a policy standpoint. I will review what Dr. Lim and Commander Fine discussed earlier about comparative analyses because this is a really critical thing that we want to make sure that is clear to people. There will be a panel after, so if you have any other questions, you can ask again at the panel if we haven't gotten to them already. So the one thing that I will do at the end of this talk that's a little different is I will focus also on some of the orally inhaled and nasal drug products just at the very end. But a lot of these concepts are the same no matter what kind of combination product you're developing as a generic. So again, when we're talking about a generic combination product, we really focus on substitutability. In relation to the RLD, we expect generic products to be pharmaceutically equivalent, which you all know means same active ingredient, same dosage form, same route of administration, and they have to meet the compendial standards of strength, quality, purity, and identity. We also expect them to be bioequivalent so that there's no significant difference in the rate and extent of absorption of the active ingredient at the site of action. And particularly for the orally inhaled products, at the site of action means in the lungs, which means it's really hard to figure that out and how to measure that, which is why we end up relying on that weight of evidence approach that Dr. Newman discussed earlier. The last piece, of course, is the therapeutically equivalent portion, and we want these approved drug products that are pharmaceutical equivalents for which bioequivalence has already been determined, that they can be expected to have the same clinical effect and safety profile when we administer them to patients under the conditions that are specified in the labeling. Now, in general, some of our considerations that we talk about when we're thinking about comparative analyses are the performance characteristics of a product. And basically, when we're reviewing a generic combination product, that's informed by the framework for ANDAs in general. It also takes into consideration performance of the device constituent and its interaction and impact on delivery of the drug component. And we also talk about our user interface, and I'll define that in a minute. So you've now seen this slide, I think, 3 or 4 times this morning, our draft comparative analyses guidance. Some of the key takeaways from this document that we really want you to focus on. First, FDA does not expect that the design of your user interface for your generic drug-device combination product, it does not have to be identical to the design of the user interface for the RLD on which it references. The differences in the design for that user interface, however, should be adequately analyzed, scientifically justified, and otherwise not preclude approval under an ANDA. And last, FDA intends to assess whether an end user can use that generic combination product when it's substituted for the reference listed drug without the intervention of a healthcare provider and or without additional training prior to the use of that generic combination product. We know that certain labeling differences, which can reflect the differences in design of a proposed generic drug-device combination product, may be permissible and would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So if we find that your difference is acceptable, then a change in the labeling that reflects that difference is also acceptable. And baseline assessment for any identified difference occurs during those comparative analyses, which we've talked about, and will determine whether or not additional information and or data is warranted. And again, I just want to bring up the point, additional information and or data may take many different forms. It's up to you to determine what's going to answer the question that's outlying for your specific product. And only one type of additional information or data is what we call a comparative use human factor study. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about a comparative use human factor study because our expectation is that you will do such a great job designing your generic device that references its RLD that there won't be anything more than minor, and therefore you won't have to go down this route. That's a good hope, right? So again, just want to cover some definitions to make sure everybody understands what I'm talking about, because I go over these terms rather quickly. So the user interface is referring to all components of a product with which a user could interact, including labeling, package, delivery device constituent part, any associated controls or displays. When I refer to external critical design attributes, these are features that directly affect how a user performs a critical task necessary in order to use or administer the product. And the critical task is, for example, a task that if you perform it incorrectly or don't perform it at all, it would or could cause harm to the patient or the user, where harm can be defined as including compromised medical care. So again, the comparative analyses, the guidance calls out 3 specific analyses that you would do. The first is a labeling comparison. And this is a side-by-side, line-by-line comparison of the full prescribing information, instructions for use, descriptions of the delivery device constituent parts for the generic combination product and its RLD. When we're talking about user interface, we tend to focus more on the instructions for use, because that's what's going to define how a user interacts with that product. So that's the place where we focus more on. We look at the second task is a comparative task analysis. This is where we assess the differences between an RLD and the proposed generic drug device combination product. What steps do you have to take to actually make it work? And the third is a physical comparison of a delivery device constituent product. This can be visual, auditory, tactile, all of the above, of the physical features of the device, such as the size, its shape, any feedback elements that it has of that RLD product, and compare that to those of the delivery device constituent part for the proposed generic. So for example, if you're making a metered dose inhaler and you have an actuator that is this big compared to the reference listed drug, which is this big, that may be a big problem, because I certainly don't have hands that are big enough to get around and actuate that device if it's ginormous. So those are the kind of things you need to keep in mind as you're developing your product. So now that you've done those 3 comparative analyses, we want you to assess those identified differences. And the differences, looking at those differences between your user interface of your proposed product and that of the RLD in the context of the overall risk profile for the product itself. You can have no differences. You're spot on, you're exactly the same, except for your trademark and your name. That would be great. We know that can't always happen, though. So most people will find that they have minor differences. And the guidance describes a minor design difference as something, as a difference in the user interface in comparison to the RLD product that does not affect an external critical design attribute. Then the third bucket is other differences. So other differences can include other differences that may be able to be justified and would be acceptable. It may also include other differences that we feel that are so different that it does affect something significant that you really, the device as you've designed it to this point would not be acceptable for an ANDA. So now I'm just going to move on. I went through that fairly quickly, but I'm going to talk a little bit more in context of an example for a dry powder inhaler. So many of you may know there's been a product-specific guidance for fluticasone, propionate, salmeterol, and afoate, which was posted back in September 2013. It was actually the first it was actually the first PSG that was published for a dry powder inhaler device with the agency. So this recommendation in the PSG, it recommends that studies for bioequivalence, formulation sameness, and device considerations. And the good news, we approved the first generic FPSX dry powder inhaler in January of 2019 of this year. So when we looked at that, we considered the device and user interface considerations. And when we were assessing that with our comparative analyses, we felt that there were other differences. And then those other differences were addressed with additional data, which was deemed appropriate for submission in an ANDA and was ultimately found to be acceptable. So On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the reference-listed drug product Advair, and on the right hand of the side, you'll see the generic product that's been approved. And you can see when you're looking at it that the way we in clinical practice refer to this is the Advair is held like a hamburger, and the generic is held like a taco. Patients like that. They understand food analogies. It works well. And so when we were assessing this, we weren't sure what was going to happen with this slight difference in user interface. The important thing to note is that the critical tasks to use the product, open, click, inhale, close, are exactly the same. Okay, so this did not impact a critical task. And it had an external critical design attribute, that orientation, which may or may not have affected, we weren't sure. So the firm was able to provide us information that gave us confidence that this was acceptable of a difference. And so the two places where this is noted are in that inhale step. Again, the orientation is slightly different. And in the close the device, the way that you close the difference is slightly different. But those slight differences were deemed to be acceptable. And again, same critical task. Inhale, close the device. So those were both the same. So hopefully that example has helped to maybe help you visualize a little bit more what we mean when we talk about doing comparative analyses and what steps we would go through and what we would do in a case where there was a difference that was deemed other than minor. So we have some recommendations for you. The first is we propose that you read the draft guidance for industry on comparative analyses. Can't emphasize this enough. We tried hard to make sure that that guidance document really clarified. Nowhere in there, I promise, does it say that you have to do a comparative use human factor study for every single product. I swear, I promise. It does not say that. The second issue, the second thing is really consider your user interface and the critical tasks of that RLD product and evaluate risks that would be associated with any identified differences in the user interface against your product. A third step, we want you to perform the comparative analyses throughout development and really seek to minimize differences from the RLD product if and when that's possible. So again, I think I brought this up in the earlier session, and I know I talked to some people in the break. When do you do a comparative analysis? Well, you probably need to do it early in development with your product after you've done a few tests just to make sure things work. And then you want to assess it and compare it to the RLD. Are we still on track? Do we see any major differences? Are we really concerned about anything? Where do we fall? If there are some differences, what risk would we have in having that difference for that user interface piece? And then as you get closer and closer to the end of your development, you want to be able to reassess and make sure that you're still in the same place that you thought you were. One example that I use is, say you're making a dry powder inhaler device and you have a lever that clicks on your device. You designed it, you did a comparative analysis, you think your lever is just like the RLD product, but when you go on in further development, say you find out that pushing the device, part of the internal mechanism of the device gets in the way of your product, your outflow tract, and now it affects your APSD. So you got to tweak the device a little to make sure that it works right so that you can make sure that you're delivering the right amount of product, for example. And so you may have to change the shape of it, or you may have to change something about the plastic that's used, or there may be some other reason why you'd make a change to your device during development. But then you have to go back at the end to say, is that device, have we done our comparative analyses? Are we still the same as the RLD product? So make sure that you keep that in mind as you go through your development program. Another step is that we suggest, again, consider those differences in terms of the risk of impacting that external critical design attribute that would involve administration of the product for those end users. Another step is we want you to talk early and often with FDA. All of my predecessing speakers today have come up and told you ways to contact the FDA to discuss these issues. You can contact us for control correspondences, for device user interface assessments. You can do it in terms of a pre-ANDA meeting if you have a complex product. So there are lots of different ways to reach out and contact FDA to talk about comparative analyses. And thank you so much for your time and attention, and I hope that was instructive.